Oh, an earthquake.
I'll tell you something. This is a program that I've wanted to do for a long, long time. I have a group of gentlemen from the Plattsburgh area who've been friends of mine for decades and friends of the North Country and other parts of the world for a lot longer than that. These are the old radio and television guys that I've talked so much about and worked so much with. Our little corner is located in Art Pierce's piano workshop on the second floor at 104 Margaret Street in downtown Plattsburgh. And from what we've seen in the last 15 minutes before this program began, we're going to do another one right here about the history of how Art fixes these pianos and puts them all together. To my right, Arthur E. Pierce Cadiddlehopper. How are you, Arthur?
Good, great, great.
And to my left, Chet Bosworth, the old happy whistler. I'm stressing happy in that phrase. And there's the famous Bird Berdan right over on the other side. And when I did a newspaper column a few weeks back trying to decide how many years total we'd all been in the media, I lost track at about 200. So that's very possible. Let's start on this side with Arthur.
Yeah?
When did you start in the business, Art?
1951.
Where?
In Holton, Maine. Up at WABM in Holton, Maine.
It's colder up there.
And in about 2 years I was chief announcer and decided it was time to get the devil out of Maine, because in Holton, Maine, the winter starts in October, I mean the 1st of October, and it doesn't stop until the end of May. And I was really fed up with it. So I decided, I called my agent in New York and I said, hell, get me another job somewhere else. I said, this is too much. So he found that George Bissell at WEAV needed an announcer.
There's a name we'll mention more than once today.
I called Mr. Bissell and he hired me right over the phone. And I came here on November 5th, 1953, and did my first news broadcast at the groundbreaking ceremonies at Plattsburgh Air Force Base. In that time, in those days, I had a better voice than I got now. The asthma has kind of taken my voice away, but that's how I got started here in Plattsburgh, was at WEAV. I worked there for about, I guess 8 years, and had a falling out with Mr. Bissell, and I went to WIRY and I got a job with Don Pelkey and his station. And I stayed there for 8 years and decided that it was time to leave after a while. I was not happy doing the all-night programming, and I was doing this piano work as a hobby. And I decided, well, why not make it a profession? So that's exactly what I did. I got out and helped start WKDR as a part-time announcer for him while I built my business. Then it got too busy and I had to give up radio altogether. But I've never been sorry, but I've never been sorry that I started either.
You went to radio school, didn't you, at one point?
In New York City, yeah. I went to the Cambridge School of Radio Broadcasting on 42nd Street in New York City for about 18 months. And I made my audition recordings and sent them all around the Northeast to see if I could land a job. And the manager in Holton, Maine hired me sight unseen. Said, that voice sounds all right to me, so come on up, he says. Oh, it was tough getting started. Oh,
I wish we had some recordings of...
My mother has some of my early days.
Isn't that amazing?
They're down and they're stored in the cellar of my brother's house down in Newburyport, Massachusetts. But there's some what do you call it, audition discs. In those days you didn't have tapes then, you had discs. You had to cut a disc, and so she's got a couple of those discs down there that I used. And a couple of my singing discs.
Oh boy.
I used to sing with a country western band.
Oh boy.
Oh, that was a riot, man. I lied.
You weren't Uncle Ezra back then.
No.
We're going to talk about
I
Uncle
wasn't
Ezra.
Uncle Ezra until I got on to WIRY.
We're just going to get the dull backgrounds through here, and then we're going to get into the fun stuff. And boy, do we have some fun memories. Chester, you told me once you started broadcasting in high school.
Right.
Tell me about it.
I started at a little radio station there back in, 1939.
I love it.
And they had radio in those days.
Yeah, no,
It was a lot like a radio station that WIRY was, except that you didn't work from the board. You sat in a booth and the engineers played the music for you. I had a program that I started by going to school when I was still in high school, going to the radio station, and I'd get off at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and jump on my bicycle and pedal like the devil way across town where the radio station was. And it would be, in the summertime, it was hot down there, and you'd walk into that radio station. It was the only place I know of that had air conditioning, and boy did they have it high. And you'd walk in and that felt like a refrigerator, but then when you walked out again, you really died.
Now, what city was this?
St. Petersburg, in Florida.
And you were in high school.
Yes, I was. And I only worked for a few hours each day. And I got paid $3.50, not an hour. That was for the week. But I thought I was hot stuff. And I ran a program called Listen.
He was going to say, "Listen here, Plattsburgh."
That came much later.
It was called Let's Jive.
Hey.
Well, all right, there's a word.
And we would play records. And I used to get piles of mail, especially from the black community down there, because that was the only time they got to hear the kind of music they wanted to hear. And that was a lot of fun.
You were smitten.
I was smitten.
But did you ever realize that that would be your lifetime vocation at that time?
No, not really. I went into the Navy then, and I expected to go to college and perhaps go on the stage.
You did a little bit of that too.
But it was a good experience, of course. Led me down the wrong path, maybe, in the radio business, but...
Never mind the paths we've been down, and we've been down some interesting paths. What year was it you retired from WIRY? Was it?
Oh, jeez.
I can't remember. Was it 95?
Yeah.
Was it more than 3 years ago?
It was about...
They go by, I think 95 or 6.
Yeah, I think it was.
If anybody were to ask me to recall specific dates, it's difficult. I can remember when I started radio here, and when I moved from WEAV to WIRY, those dates are very, very secure. But most of the dates in between are just a little bit foggy.
He followed me.
I think
Yeah.
most of us worked with George Bissell. Started out with him.
Yeah.
All of us did.
Yeah.
Right.
All of us, the 4 of us did. My wife, just before we get to Birdie, my wife found the original wire that came to me in East Northport, Long Island, from WEAV, George Bissell, and it was addressed to Warden, W-A-R-D-E-N, Warden Little, Long Island, and it told me to come up for an audition tape.
Well, they knew Plattsburgh was close to Dannemora, maybe.
Maybe that was it. I never thought of that. and I carried that around in my wallet because that was the one that got me the first audition at WEAV. Birdie, how'd you begin?
Same way. I was making the rounds in 1948, and I went down through Poughkeepsie and down that way on auditions, and I finally ended up in Plattsburgh, New York. My wife was a Plattsburgh native, and her father knew George Bissell, so I got an interview, and I started there in the spring of 1948.
she was an engineer.
She was an engineer at WRGB in Schenectady during the war years, you know, in the early 40s. She started out GY radio, then she went over to WRGB, which was just an experimental station in those days. And she worked her way up to audio engineer and first-class radio operator.
And you know what I've heard many times, station managers liked female engineers because they'd come to work on time, get the job done, and go home. And some of the young male engineers were not quite so trustworthy, shall we say, back in those days.
Well, the thing I liked about Dot was when we asked for a record to start, she had it ready, and she didn't fool around. You could start we had a little signal where you would push down once for it to start, and 2 for cutting back for the talk over, and then back again. And she never missed. And some of the guys, they would sit back and sort of stare off into the distance, and if they heard the number, oh, you want some music?
You remember when George Bissell had the studio, when I first came here, it was over where the little bank is now on the corner of Cornelia.
Yeah.
All right, the engineer used to be out on the Lake Shore Road, and he had all the records and everything out there.
That's right.
So when you announced your record, you had a little button that you had to push when you wanted him to let it go.
And that's where Dot was out.
And old Larry LePan used to be right on the ball all the time.
Larry
Him and Jack Nazak. Oh boy.
Yes.
Well, now, what was that address? 38 Court? Does anybody remember
that was
the
Margaret
address?
Street. That
That was Margaret Street.
Yeah.
And then
He was on
Margaret
Margaret Street. That was just before the drugstore burned down. Remember the drugstore that was on the corner caught fire?
Mm-hmm.
We were all sitting in the windows watching the damn place burn. Jesus.
But it was on Court Street when I came here in '61 then.
Yes, we were next door to the furniture store on Court Street.
That was a nice building.
That was a nice
Very
building. You bet
nice
it was.
building.
All stone.
Well, yeah, it was, you could say that it was a historic house because it had been there for years.
Yeah.
And Bissell
Rehabilitated it. He added on to it. A long building was added on to take care of the studios. The main offices and the control room were in the big stone building. You had to cut through the wall to make that window into the studio.
And they made him tear it down, or the city required it, or the state, county, I guess.
Yeah, they were going to make a parking lot.
Yeah, but that was too bad. That building was.
It was a nice building.
Nice building, and they.
Bissell did a beautiful job of fixing it up.
Yeah.
When did FM start? When did they start
Well,
their FM?
while they were on Court Street.
Yeah.
The FM tower was there when I first came there. On the 4th of July, 1961.
Yes, yeah. And I was one of the. I had to have the night shift with the FM, and I had a program called Nocturne, in which I recited love poems and poems of friendship and all that stuff over music. And we used to get bombarded with letters, some from Vermont and every place. George Bissell says, "What the hell are you doing?"
Yeah,
I said, "Well," "they like it, that's all."
I tried to get him to play some classical music, and he wanted to have the Yankee games on.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, we can get the Yankee games on the AM." Well, all right, but he finally. First thing I knew, he was back to baseball. He wanted to listen to the FM,
I know
but
it.
he also wanted to listen to the Yankees.
Yeah.
You didn't argue with George.
No, you didn't argue with George Bissell. No way.
You'd think you had him convinced of something, but if it wasn't quite what he wanted, he just remember the music. He wanted to play what he called beautiful music.
Yes, Norman Cloutier.
Oh boy!
Yeah. He made me. He had me as when I first went there. He had me as assistant to the newsman, who was a guy named Jack Charles. He was a hell of a nice guy. And after that, he put me in charge of what was called the record library. Now, the records would come in from all of these distributors, and I had to sort them out, audition them, and put them in a book, and label whether it was bright, medium, or slow.
That was down in the basement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh?
And we should point out then that records were 78 RPMs.
Most of them, yeah.
Most of them were 78
And the
RPMs.
45s came along.
and larger transcriptions.
Yeah, you get a whole
I'm
half-hour
sure.
program.
I'm sure our audience has no idea what a transcription is, or an ET,
Oh, there was
or any
something
of those
else.
phrases that
There
we
were
use.
records that were that big. Big 18-inch records. Wow, were they big.
Eddie Arnold, the Tennessee Plowboy.
Oh,
Yeah.
boy.
Whole 15-minute
Oh,
checkerboard
sure.
little show. It was
Portia
great.
Faces Life. And the soap operas that we used to play in the afternoon were on these big ZIV recordings.
All right.
Yeah, we had one about Glen Falls, it was called, and I thought at first that it was
Glens Falls.
Glens Falls, and that somebody had made
I
a
don't
mistake,
remember.
but then it was Glen Falls out in Minnesota or something, where it was said the scene of the soap opera was. And we started it up, and it ran for 36 weeks or something like that. And they got to a very peak point in the play, and all of a sudden we were out of transcriptions.
I left
They didn't have any more, but
I
we had them there, and George says, let's play them in the afternoon. And people called up, and, what in the world do you do? What happened to the show? We had to tell them that we ran out of
out of steam.
No more records, huh?
no more records.
Yeah, they had, I remember we had Fib McGee and Molly on the ZIV. We had Renfrew of the Mountain.
Renfrew.
Yeah, Renfrew
Mountain.
was
What the
mounted.
heck was that? I never heard
Well,
of that
it
one.
used to come on with a wolf howling, and a guy would say, Renfrew of the Mountain.
Yeah.
They were wild
Mine was
days.
that WEAV from 48 to 52. You remember Angelo's restaurant? That was the
yeah.
coffee place.
Yes.
In those days. It was a bakery, I guess, but
Yes.
it had a little
Yeah,
restaurant.
Peter was a great guy.
That was the coffee place. And Connor's Pharmacy then had a soda fountain
Right on the corner.
on the corner before it all burned.
That's the one that burned down.
Yeah. There were some beautiful houses in back of the studio, too.
Yeah.
And now it's all parking.
All
lot.
gone.
They were all torn down.
A couple of things we can mention. Some of those transcriptions that we're talking about in those days were inside out. Who
Yes.
wants to explain what that was all
Well,
about?
that's the way they recorded them.
They record from the inside.
Yeah.
Nowadays, if any of the young people watching this program even know what records are, isn't this amazing? Even know what vinyl records are, they're used to putting a needle on
Yeah,
near the outside. But in those
Exactly.
days, they'd record
from the inside
hub.
out.
And you find one of those and try to play it back, and the
You can't
needle
do
will
it
jump
anymore.
out.
That's right. It won't do it anymore. You have to have a, believe it or not, you got to have a Victrola with the needle in it, so that it'll track either way. You remember the old Victrolas?
Oh, sure.
Wind up.
Do we? Recording devices have changed a great deal since the early
Oh,
days
my
of
heavens,
radio,
yes, I should
and
say
when
so.
Art says we used to have to, if we wanted to record something, we had to cut it
On the inside out.
on the
George
inside
Bissell had
out.
a beautiful cutting set in the basement. Remember that one that was
Yes,
downstairs? That was beautiful.
You would put a blank disc
Put a
on,
blank disc on, yeah. And you'd start in the middle, or near the pinhole. You'd come out about an inch and a half or so, and you'd start your tape. Start your machine, and do your commercial and whatever it was they had to put on it. And boy,
the
if you made a
shavings were-
mistake,
The little
if you made a
fine
mistake, you
shaving.
were
Little
wiped
fine
out.
Black hair,
shavings.
yeah. And they
Yeah.
brush it off.
and you couldn't erase it if you
No
screwed
way,
it up,
no.
could you?
You had to start with another disc, and that got pretty expensive.
So that's where you
Mazak was
learned
very
it.
good at that.
Oh, boy.
I remember one time Jack was working back at WIRY, and I was there too, and in came Norman Rockwell. Not Norman Rockwell.
The famous painter? No.
Yeah,
Oh, the writer from Los Abel Forest.
Yeah, right.
What's his name?
Here we are, four old guys who can't remember.
Well, I have Mr.
Rockwell Kent.
Rockwell's
Rockwell Kent.
Rockwell Kent, we got it.
somewhere
We
in
have
my
to pool our
files.
brains here.
Somewhere in my files, I still have a photostat of a check from Rockwell Kent for a piano I sold to him
Oh.
about 30 years ago.
Keep that. That could be some value. This guy was
Really?
quite a man. Yeah.
Huh?
Hard
Well,
to
I
say.
still have the copy somewhere around here.
He came into the radio station and he wanted Jack Nazak. He heard that we had a recording system and he wanted to make some little greetings for his friends, and he had a list of a lot of friends. He wanted the same recording for all of them, and so I went back and I thought, boy, this isn't going to work. We can't do that. I told Mazak about it, and he said, "What's this guy want?" I said, "It's Rockwell Kent." Who's Rockwell Kent? He said. He said, "We can't do that." So I went out and I told him, "I'm sorry, we don't seem to be." Well, he was incensed. "He's Rockwell Kent, and you don't say no to Rockwell Kent." Jack Nazak said no to him. He didn't even talk to him. He wouldn't have anything to do with him. It was an impossible thing to do. Nowadays it would be, you know, no problem at all.
Well, even in those days, in a record studio, they would make a master and then make copies of it. But in the average recording studio and a radio station, you made one at a time for that use. And so, since recording was expensive, and most of our bosses didn't like us to use those extra blanks, most of the commercials were done live.
That's right.
There was a thing called the book. And it was a loose leaf book that very often sat on a little easel in front of you over you'll hear us talk about the board. We have to be careful to explain our shop talk here. The board is the console with all the knobs and dials that we would turn to raise the levels of the sound and so on. In the early days, as the gentleman has mentioned, there was a control room engineer, and you were an announcer, and you operated from a booth. A soundproof booth. You were the only one in there. You could generally see the engineer, except for the early days when the engineer was remoted way down on the lake shore. But in those days, after those days, then you ran your own control board and so on, and you had a copywriter. Who were some of the earliest copywriters? These people that wrote the commercials.
There was
Fox.
Esther Fox.
Al Corsi.
Al Corsi.
Well, he was with WEAV.
And then
most of us went back and forth.
The one that was with WIRY was, what was her name?
Esther Fox.
Esther Fox.
Esther Fox. Yeah. And there was another one.
Betty Krause.
Betty Krause.
Betty Krause had many jobs at WIRY.
She didn't write the copy. I don't remember.
And she had a woman's program. She had all kinds of things. It was quite
Woman's World.
Quite a girl.
All of us have tremendous anecdotes, and as you've learned, if any of you read my newspaper column, sometimes I combine them by mistake. I got off on one of Art's.
Oh, gee whiz.
He'd tell jokes on me if he could remember any, but I remembered the time when you hurt your hand.
Oh, boy.
Art told me after I had written that column that he really did hurt his hand. What was that day all about?
Well,
explain that.
On that particular day that I hurt my hand, two Canadians came in to the studio. It was a Sunday afternoon.
Was that here on Court Street?
On Court Street. And the baseball game was on, and Mel Allen had just given a cue for a station break. I did the station break. Heaven help you if you didn't. And I went outside to greet the people who came in, which was an order Mr. Bissell had given, that you were always to greet people who came in and show them the studio and so forth with courtesy, etc. Well, I went out to greet them, and I was talking with them. We were down the end of the hall, down toward the newsroom. And don't you think Mel Allen wanted to light a cigarette, so he went over and gave another station break, and I had to run for the control room. Well, I ran my butt down the hall, go through the sound lock with the big heavy doors, and I tried to reach across to the control panel and open the switch to say WEAV, and the door slammed on my hands and broke 2 fingers.
Oh, boy.
And here I'm in agony, and I opened the mic, tried to give a station break, and all I could do was holler. Well, as soon as I got off that telephone, that damn phone rang, and George Bissell was on the other end. "How come you missed that station break?" I says, "George, I missed the station break because I was out," and I was half crying at the time, because I was out in the hall taking care of some people who came in. And I says, Mel had just given a break, and I had no anticipation that he'd given me another one that quick. And I says, I ran for the studio. I tried to do the break, and I says, the door slammed on my fingers, and my fingers are broken. 2 of them. I said, God damn it, you and your station breaks.
I think you left.
I was mad at him.
Didn't you leave the next day?
I left the next day. I told him, I says, George, you are totally unreasonable.
That was
I says,
about.
you should have realized that when something went wrong and I explained it to you, you should have said, I'm sorry. But I said, no, you got to get mad at me and tell me there was no excuse, even though my hands were jammed in the door. I said, do you think that's right?
You know what that proves?
Huh?
It proves that we all took our jobs very, very seriously.
Oh yeah, and the time before that Gordie got mixed up was one time on a Sunday.
You brought it up now.
On a Sunday afternoon, I had to go to the men's room, and the station break again. In one of these situations, Alan had given a station break. I went to the men's room, and the secretary was sitting in the front hall doing makeup work. I forgot her name, but I know who she is. Anyway, the break came again. I had to run for the control room. This time I made it, but my pants were half down. I had to go past the secretary and move my. Well, I'm telling you.
Okay. Well, I combined the two in the interest of space, and because I didn't remember they were two separate incidents.
You know, this makes me think that this is what we call oral history, and a lot of everybody has a little different version of each thing that has happened in the past.
Oh yeah.
And you wonder, this goes back generations of word of mouth being handed down. Each time it's handed down to a member of the family, it's maybe dressed up a little more than it was before.
Of course it is.
And
I guarantee you, mine's not dressed up. That's what happened.
Or dressed down in your case.
Yeah.
But that's true.
But we all have different ideas of the same. I remember one time Bird was doing.
Here we go, Brady.
He was doing a program. This was up at WEAV, and we had a program called what was it?
Time Out.
Time Out.
Yeah.
And I sat on the control room. I would blow a whistle
Oh yeah.
and yell, "Time Out!" And then we would cut in, and Bird would we would take turns of reading about what the AP wire said, or the UPI wire, I don't remember which, whatever it was. And so Bird would do a program for women, as I remember.
I guess.
A little short blurb for women. And for some reason, before he went in there, he told me what they were going to say on the air, and as a little cue for me to cut in at a certain time for them in the other room in the big studio. And he sat down and he said, "Baby Snooks." And I wrote down on the card, "Baby Snooks." And I don't know what made him say "Baby Snooks." I don't think he did either.
He still doesn't know.
But I opened up the microphone and said, "Baby Snooks," which was his cue to start reading the word. Well, Baby Snooks was nowhere near this piece of paper he was reading. It was something else about women, and he sat and he stopped and he started to read, and all of a sudden he realized what had happened, and he says, I'm telling you, we got a call from George on that one too. What are you people doing down there? He said.
Notice most of this was one-man operation too. When we did that program, there were a couple of guys around, but like Art says, you're there all alone a lot of times.
Oh yeah, well, at the noon hour, we would all sort of get there at the same time.
That was the busy time.
Yeah, and then you would go back, and you had a split shift. People hated split shifts, because, but we were glad to get the work.
Station owners and managers loved split shifts because they could cover a great deal of the day with one person, and you're liable to sign the station on. I can recall on Sundays, meant for years, signing the station on in the morning and signing it off at night. Working so many hours in the morning, going home, take a nap, come back at night, sign the station off. And in those days, radio announcers, although they were highly regarded in the community, were not necessarily the highest paid of the
Tell me
people in
about
the
it.
workforce in the community. And so when I said before that we were dedicated, we were.
You had to love
Maybe
your
we
job.
weren't too smart now that I think about it.
Probably works.
But we were glad to get a job. As everyone here has said, we were glad to have a job, and we were glad to work in radio. And there was a certain notoriety involved, and we had an awful lot of fun doing things with and for our small community here.
Yeah.
I'm sure that radio in those days wasn't that much different from radio elsewhere, but we kind of thought our town was
Oh, it
special.
was special. It was special.
That Time Out program had a little bit of news, little sports, little women's features, just stuff like
And we
that.
played a
Little tidbits, little music in between.
Yeah.
And Martin Mannix was the newsman then, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, he had pigeons all over downtown here. He would get his little reports.
Joel Chandler was the one that worked on
That's
that.
right, Joel.
Oh,
Chandler.
Joel Chandler, a
So,
name I haven't
yes,
remembered
yes.
in
He went over.
years.
He went over to
WVMT or CAX?
well, one of those stations over there, and he did a show called Across the
Across the Fence, yeah. For many years.
Nice Boy. Woo, nice boy.
Boy.
Yeah.
Now we're old men. Da-da-da-da.
You know, I was just thinking, and I don't know why it popped into my mind as we were chatting here, but Ray Falconer, who did the Weather Network here for the entire Northeast region,
Yeah.
as far as I know, is still alive and well and lives down near the Albany area. I've talked to him on the phone, probably not in a year, but remember when we used to have to punch up that
Yes.
Weather Network
Yes.
at WEAV back in those days?
And if you missed it, you were in deep trouble.
I have no idea how it came in. Some kind of a shortwave
Yeah,
receiver,
I
maybe,
think so,
from down
yeah.
there.
Something like that. I think it came in at the engineer's house down on Route 9, where Larry LePan and Jack Nazak used to work. And they had the thing, when you cued it in, you simply shut your microphone off and it went directly into the transmitter. That's what it did, from Lake Shore Road.
We had a program on WEAV too in the morning for a while that was the weather forecast for all over the state. You had to record these guys when they called in, and there would be one from Buffalo maybe, and one from Rochester, and one from Syracuse.
We used to call them remotes.
Yeah, and then you played them back at a certain time in the morning.
Never forget the time when I first went to work in radio up in Maine. And of course, I was nervous as all get out. And they had a program sponsored by the Rod and Gun Club of Holton. Well, I was forever getting the names mixed up and calling it the Guard and Run Club. Well, finally, the manager come bursting through the door one day after, and he says, "For God's sake, Pierce," he says, "when are you going to learn to say Rod and Gun Club?" And that cured me. I was so frightened of him. He was a big German with a great big head on him, and oh man, old Ted Kaufman.
We've all had our share of bloopers,
Oh,
some
boy.
of which we'd like to forget.
Some of which we
Unlike
don't dare repeat.
that too, but unlike modern television where virtually everything is pre-recorded except local newscasts are still live, in those days almost everything you did was live.
Yeah.
And if you messed up or
You had to learn to read copy without rehearsing it. That's all there was to it. You didn't have time.
difficult for young announcers and television
read.
personalities
That's
to
right.
learn to do that now, but we, most of what we did was flying directly by the seat of our pants, and we would have to read not only the copy, the commercials, having never seen them before.
Sometimes.
And you're on the board. You got a turntable here, a turntable here. While you're doing the commercial, you're feeling with your hands, getting a record set up,
sure.
ready to go.
The whole business.
And
After,
queuing it up in your earphone, see?
Yep.
Well, if you made a mistake, you queued it up on the ear.
yeah, that too. That too.
Or you could hit it with your elbow while it was playing.
So the old WEAV setup wasn't bad. Pressing the button.
Yeah, that
the
was pretty
engineer
good.
did the work.
Well, managers and radio station owners soon learned that if one guy could do it, why would Why would he take two? It's like snowplow operators these days who have to run the wing of the plow with all these levers, and what the heck, they say, if they can get one guy to do it. And as all of us have mentioned at one time or another, later on, very often you were the only person in that building, especially in the evening or on the weekend, and you had the entire responsibility of that radio station.
And you couldn't let anyone in. Remember?
The doors were locked. Nobody could come inside.
Donald Pelkey's son would be out on the town. And he would want to come in some night at 2 o'clock in the morning, wanted to get into the studio. And I wouldn't let him in. Because I didn't know who he was at the time. And so the next day, Mr. Pelkey comes and he says, how come you wouldn't let Don in? I says, Don, you know what the rule is. The law is, the FCC law is that you let no one in after hours because you are not the engineer. You have a right to run the board with the transmitter on with an engineer on call. But he wasn't the engineer and I wasn't about to let him in.
We had a fellow on at night when I was at WIRY, and he was very nervous. He had a phobia about somebody coming in and getting him, I guess. And he was on the board one night, and I came walking in, and he thought he heard something out there, but he wasn't quite sure, and he didn't want to go out and look. But I was coming down the hall as he came out. Oh my God, he said. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I felt sorry for him, but he really had a phobia about being carried away, I guess. I don't know what it was. I told him I didn't think I was that ugly.
You know, we could all tell stories, and it's much better if we tell them on each other, because we don't remember the really tense things that happened with us, but how we reacted under pressure at different times when things would just pile up and there'd be 13 fires and so many accidents, and you couldn't find the record. I still dream about not being able to get a record queued up to go on the turntable.
Oh, me too.
This still in my dream.
Yes, I do. I still dream.
And I remember one wonderful story when Art was on the air one night, and we all jumped in the WIRY mobile unit and came downtown for one of the big fires. I can't remember. And you were on the air, and you were so busy answering the telephones and talking with the people on our little two-way radios, and you put a record on, a long-playing record, which was great, except that it was in the summertime, and it was a Christmas. The first album you grabbed was a Christmas album.
Oh, yeah.
And the town is burning, and Jingle Bells was on the radio.
Back.
And you, of course, you were embarrassed, and we were all embarrassed.
I kind of like that film.
Like the night I fell asleep. The night I fell asleep on the air at WIRY. I had just started working the all-night WIRY nightclub, and I had to do commercials at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I had put on a long play record by, who was it? Oh, I can't think of her name now because I want to, but anyway, it was a long play. She was singing beautiful songs, right? So I'm at the control, thumbing through the copy that I was going to have to record, and the next thing I knew, the telephones were all ringing. And the lights were flashing all over the place on the telephone. I had fallen asleep at the controls.
Did it stick in the groove?
That's what you call being relaxed.
And here was, the record was going shh.
Oh, yeah, that ended.
Oh, that's an awful sound. It haunts me today.
Oh, man. So I answered one of the phones, and some woman said, you fell asleep, didn't you? I says, how long has it been going on? She says, a good 10 minutes. Oh, my aching back. I was so embarrassed.
Nice.
I can remember a time in those days, as Art said, the record companies would send large numbers of records. You'd get these giant packages of records every week. You'd have to listen. And I remember having a stack of 45 RPM records to my left. And in those days, I smoked lots of cigarettes. And I dozed while a record was on, and the cigarette in my hand came down like this and put a nice extra groove in about 200 records. Brand new records which never got on the air.
Oh, yeah.
And nobody knew why. Before we go any farther, I have to bring up the incident with you and Martin Mannix and the wheelbarrow. I've had so many people mention that to me over the last few weeks. You still have that photograph, don't you?
Yeah.
How did that all come about?
He was an ardent Dodger fan. He came from Brooklyn originally, I believe. And I was just as much a Giant fan in those days. Both of them still were in Brooklyn and in New York. And the Dodgers were well ahead of the Giants during the period of the season. And I have said to him, you know, the Giants are going to beat the Dodgers, and they're going to win the pennant. He said, that'll never happen. You're crazy. I said, I will bet you if the Dodgers win the pennant and beat the Giants out, I will push you down Margaret Street in a wheelbarrow. He said, all right, you're on. And we kept talking about that and made a little to-do about it during the season. And so it turned out that the Dodgers, or the Giants finally won the pennant. They had a very great second half of the season, you might say. So Mannix said, all right, we'll push you, I'll push you down Margaret Street. And I had some signs made up. Herb Newlove had a sign. I had one that said, say hey. Willie Mays was the big hey, Willie Mays.
Oh, yeah.
Say hey. And I had a plaque across it for him to put over his shoulders, and it said, wait till next year. And we started out up here on the corner near the Witherell Hotel, and there was what was the name of that?
Fife and Drug?
No,
Oh.
there was a business there on the corner. Anyway, we started out at that right by the Witherell, and he pushed me all the way down to Cornelia Street. And boy, the crowd of the people were on both sides of the sidewalk.
I remember it.
watching that. And I wasn't too comfortable in the wheelbarrow. I sat as far forward as I could so he could have the leverage he needed. And he pushed, boy, he just hauled right down the street. He wanted to get it over with as fast as he could. We didn't stop to wave to anybody, or I did, but he just pushed.
Was that the famous Bobby Thompson home run too?
Yeah,
Was
I
that the
believe,
game that ended?
that was the game.
I remember we were all standing in the window at WEAV watching as he turned around the corner.
But you know, we should mention that radio had a
He didn't live long after that. It was just a little while
day
after
or two
that,
after,
and he died. And I always wondered if that had something to do with it, but his wife said, the doctor said, no, that wouldn't have anything to do with it. But I was not too convinced of that. I felt bad about that.
you know, while we're on the subject, I think one of us or all of us should comment on our memories of Martin Mannix and try to let our modern audience know why he was such a phenomenon. What do you remember about him, Bird?
Oh boy. How quickly he could type something up. You know, he'd get his little pigeons reporting to him over the telephone. But then he'd pick out those stories so quickly and get them on the air in time.
And if he didn't have time, that didn't bother him.
Right.
He'd just sit there and
Ad-lib, yeah.
There is a tape or two around with his voice on, and I'm sure that this was strictly an ad lib, and he was taking somebody, a doctor, or somebody in the health department to task.
He would do that.
One tape.
Yes. The alderman and the mayor and the
yeah.
Park and Beach Commission. He had a little zinger in there for many, many people. But the listeners, boy, they all tuned to that.
Well, actually,
he was always talking about his pigeons.
Yeah, his little pigeons.
And I can recall
His little tipsters.
he got assaulted down here in the park one day.
I guess.
Somebody said, "Tell your pigeons about this one," and they whacked him.
Well,
He must have said something about somebody, but I remember hearing about it in the restaurant.
There was a lawyer in town, I forget who it was, and hauled up and popped him right on the bottom.
What?
On the chin and knocked him. He sat there on his bottom, was what I intended to say right here.
In Trinity Park.
Yeah.
Well, you know, somebody told me an anecdote. I don't know if Chet was there or not. Probably. Martin worked at WIRY also for a time.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
And
yeah.
this was Schuyler Ormsby, the late Schuyler Ormsby,
Sheriff.
who was a rather imposing
Big.
personality, and physically he was a big guy.
See what?
And he took issue with something Martin said one day, and he didn't wait for the street. Schuyler was standing in the entryway when Martin got off the air, and they were nose to nose, and not quite, because Schuyler was about this much taller, standing in the front, and everybody else vacated the premises because they were sure there was going to be blood spattered. And I guess they somehow came to an amicable conclusion that day, but people told me that was pretty tense for a moment.
Schuyler sat in the room outside there while Manx was getting his news together, and they were sitting there yelling at each other.
Before the news.
Beforehand?
Yeah, before the news went. That didn't bother Manx. But
I remember his pronunciation, like Haile Selassie was in the news at those times, and different people I can't remember, but he was always joking about if you mispronounced him, you know. And he did plenty of it too.
Oh, we can. Oh, yeah. There are anecdotes again that we can't repeat on the air here, because many of our bloopers were funny because they were inadvertently obscene.
Yeah.
And some of the Russian names I can recall were connected with some of those humorous moments. And we have all found an opportunity when it was time to go on the air where a microphone wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'd read a whole newscast with no microphone in the room, or you know, or somebody else would do something. Now this is radio announcers don't break up anymore, do they?
no.
Well,
Back
not as
in
much
those
as they did
days,
then.
they did.
But nobody tries to break you up anymore. Very rarely. But in
I
those
can
days,
remember some of the tricks they used to pull on me at WEAV when I was there. There was one guy who was very tall. I can't remember his name, but he mooned through the window.
Boy, that would do it.
If you don't think that damn near broke me to pieces, I almost didn't finish the newscast. And another time, I was Santa Claus. I was doing the Santa Claus show in the afternoon, and I was reading letters and all kinds of stuff. So somebody in the studio wrote a fictitious letter, and it was so ridiculous and so absolutely funny. I cracked up. I couldn't. I said,
Santa Claus,
somebody is trying to play tricks on Santa Claus.
Santa Claus has had a lot of those.
Yeah.
I know from my experience there too. But you have to kind of look ahead on some of them.
Had a lot of fun. A lot of fun indeed.
Wait, did you guys ever break up? Did you break each other up when you worked together?
Yeah, we've had occasion to do that.
One time out.
We had a fellow named Henry Clark
Yeah.
Oh my!
at WEAV.
What was his
And
real
he-
name?
Carmine Dio.
Carmine Diorio.
But we asked him one time how he arrived at the name Henry Clark. He said, well, my middle name is Henry, and he said I happened to be eating a Clark bar at the time, and so I decided that would be it. And I didn't know for a long time that his name wasn't Henry Clark, but you could break him up. You could by standing around in back of him and looking over his shoulder. That was all you had to do. I used to knock my pipe out in the wastebasket, making sure it was out before I did it, and he could hear this tobacco going into the
waste.
and that would.
I have to tell you, I haven't told anybody this story, and I'm sure if Henry were around, he'd come and get me. But in those days, there was a lot of stand-up reading. Remember it at WEAV? You would walk in and stand up
Yes.
to a microphone and read a commercial or do what you did standing up.
And it was a big, long window.
There was a
In the
big long
hallway.
window, and the person was in the control room looking at you.
Yeah.
And Nazak was there, and we decided to pull one on Henry because he was very proud of his voice and his enunciation, and he wanted to go big time. He wanted to work for the network.
He used to practice saying, "This is CBS, the Columbia
Broadcasting system. So this one day, Nazak said, "Gordie, I think we can get him." Because he always put the earphones on. He had to hear his voice. So Jack sent his voice as he would speak through a tape recorder and back to Henry about a half second later. So
I remember that.
he started out by reading the news, and then he started repeating himself, and the whole thing was an absolute and utter shambles because he couldn't understand where this echo was coming from. So, yeah, Henry would come back and get us. I don't know whatever happened to him. What are some of the other names or some of the personalities that we've worked with through the years?
Well, there was tiny hair. There was,
Tiny.
There's that personality.
big tiny hair was something else.
Talk about an imposing personality.
He was a great guy. I used to like Tiny. He had been a state trooper in Vermont, and when we chased a fire truck or something, he didn't care if he passed on the right or the left. He was going to get by anybody that was in his way. It was really something, and he was a great guy. I liked him.
He was big, too.
Tall.
He was a big guy. Some of our viewers may remember during the Vietnam War, Tiny WIRY was one of the first small radio stations in the country to send a reporter to Vietnam way back when.
Yeah.
And we got a bag of tiny reel-to-reel tapes, put them in a bag, and gave Tiny a little tape recorder with lots of batteries, and sent him to Vietnam.
I didn't know that.
Oh,
He started out going to Paris Island. We had a group called the North Country Platoon.
Boy, did we sell that.
Very successful program. Interviewed the boys at Paris Island. Many prominent people in this area were part of that North Country Platoon. Great memories about how they arrived in Albany on their way down there, and kind of did a terrible number on a hotel, and everybody almost went to jail and ruined our entire program. But they ended up down there at Paris Island, went on to Vietnam, and Tiny ended up in Vietnam for a time, interviewing all the guys and gals from Clinton County who were serving over there at the time.
Yeah.
And he would send those reel-to-reel tapes back, and as we've all said, he was a brazen personality, ex-Marine. If he wanted to interview you, he'd jump right in the foxhole with that tape recorder on the back of a Jeep or a bulldozer, and he'd get that, and they were, I wish we had copies of some of those interviews
so do I.
remaining. They were wonderful. And it was my job to edit all this into some kind of a program on the radio, and you know, clip out all the profanity and try to make it something, and we did. And I don't know if you were a salesman at the time,
Yeah, I saw it.
but that was a very successful program for all the reasons that you can imagine. And the following year, after Tiny came back, we did a follow-up program with all the loved ones and wives and priests and teachers and relatives back here. And that was equally successful and won some very nice Associated Press awards.
When you say successful, you mean not just as an audience thing to listen to, but to be able to sell it. That was say.
That was the name of the game.
Don Pelkey was the manager there, the owner of the salesman. That was very important.
He was a real businessman.
Yes, it was.
Well, sure. The idea was to have a balancing act of good programming that was saleable. And in those days, of course, downtown Plattsburgh was far different than it is now. And many of the businesses we all knew and loved in those days were down here in Plattsburgh. And
There are a few things to remember, too, in the television side of this business.
you know, that's true. And I wrote an article, as you know, mentioning all you gentlemen a couple of weeks ago, and they inadvertently thought I had spelled W-I-R-Y wrong when I actually wrote W-I-R-I.
That's right.
And we should talk about how that came about, Bird.
Or weary eye, as one caller called me. But how's everything at weary eye?
Well, Joel Shire was the one behind it all.
There's another personality.
That's a personality. He was at WMFF and WEAV and WIRY for many, many years. #1 salesman. Ginsberg's 4 full floors of fine furniture and things like that. But he's the one that scouted up all the local businessmen, lawyers and businessmen to get behind it. It was called Great Northern Television. They formed a corporation and they started TV in the middle of 1954. And what happened then? Well, we went on. Jack Nazak was very instrumental in doing the transmitter stuff up at Terry Mountain. And then we went on the early December 9th, I think, 1954, with a test pattern. That was the first thing. And then Joel Shire made his few remarks the night before. So the next day we started full program, which was only 3 in the afternoon until about 10 or 11 at night. They ran a lot of films and local news while they were rewinding some of these big film features. We would do live news out in the studio for 8 or 10 minutes.
I think you ought to mention the trouble they had getting that tower on
Terry Mountain.
Terry Mountain.
Wow.
They hired
rugged.
They had to bring in these Mohawk men.
Indians, yeah, right. That worked the high wires, the high buildings in New York City, you know. And getting up there too, carving the road through, through rocks and trees.
What was his name? The engineer back then?
Jack Nazak was.
Jack was then. There was somebody after that who worked with Jack. When I first came here, he said, "Gordie, I'd like to take you up there and show you that 1,000-foot tower up there." And we went on a Jeep. And I've been at all the best rides in Coney Island, but that one took the cake. I was sure we were going to die, because here we are going up this old logging road to the top of that mountain. That was tough putting that up
That
there.
was the new tower that's 1,000 feet tall. The first one was much shorter. But even so, it was a job getting all that stuff up there. So they get back to these films, they call them the $1 Million Movie or something, and they would show them once, and then show them again. And then it was called Encore Theater. Like that.
Yeah.
So the announcer had to be in the booth all the time.
Then they had a couple of live shows too. The Howdy Doody show, and there was the Tex Beneke show, and the country western guys.
Oh yeah. Oh, you mean local stuff? What was his name? Tex something.
Tex Tracy.
Tex Tracy.
Yeah, Tex Tracy.
Lytle.
Smiley Lytle and the Lytle family.
Yeah.
Did we have live shows?
Oh, they loved to do that because that gave them a way to demonstrate what they could do. And
even Chet had the first kiddie show on there. Chet's Bar 5 Ranch Time.
Bar 5 Ranch.
That was an hour-long show with the little kiddies all let.
Well, we should tell people where the studio was then.
Next to McMartin Motors on 357 Cornelia.
I understand that block may be sold soon, and everybody might be moving out of there, but that's where the studio was.
Yeah, it's
a big barn of a place.
You've got an insurance company there, auto insurance. There, it's right across from at the corner of Cornelia Street and, well, it's where the Dairy Queen is, right across.
Healy Avenue.
Yeah, Healy Avenue.
Grace Reese and you used to do
Hospitality House.
Hospitality House. That was quite a show.
Live shows.
What was that all about?
Local interviews and cooking. Man, that's where I got
that's
the sweet
where it
stuff.
started, huh?
Anytime we mixed chocolate icing or cakes or anything,
Oh, he used to have to clean.
I always got to sample with it.
He cleaned out the frosting dish.
Cleaned out.
I remember that.
But you know, that brings up a very special point that I want to make before this interview is finished, in that we were required to be whatever was required of us at the moment.
That's right.
If somebody said, "You're a cooking expert," you got your pot and pan and walked out there and did it. And somebody all of a sudden one day said, "Bird, you're going to be a weatherman."
That's the way it
How
happened.
did that? Tell me about
Our first weatherman was a meteorologist, and he set everything up with the temperature thing outside, and we had like a school teacher's blackboard. That's the stuff we worked with, yellow chalk, and he would mark the fronts and everything.
What was that weatherman's name? I can't remember.
Bill Knight.
Bill Knight.
Bill Knight stayed for about a year.
Man.
He was very nice, and then he left. So somebody had to do the weather, like you say, some fill-in spots. So I got the job, and I did it for 30 years there. on the Channel 5.
You were going to do it till you got it right, huh?
He's still doing it.
One
with
time,
water.
when I was on Atlantic Weather for 12 years with the bow tie and the Atlantic sign across there. One time we were introducing the new Atlantic Imperial gas tank. You know, we had it in the studio, and a drape over it, and a rope up over the a pipe in the ceiling. Well, it came time for me to pull the rope. The darn rope broke. So we never unveiled it. I had to reach over and unveil the darn thing. Atlantic Imperial Gasoline. Atlantic keeps your car on and go. I still have a little cigarette lighter that plays that song.
There was a commercial on the air that one time it was about fireproof cloth of some kind, and you could sprinkle gasoline on it and put a match to it, and the kerosene or whatever it was would burn, but the cloth would be intact. They kept doing this day in and day out and day in and day out. Finally, the cloth got so saturated that it just burned right up the guy's fingers. Do you remember that? I don't know what it was.
We were doing them live?
Yeah, it was live. Oh yeah, they were alive.
Checking the pianos here.
Go for it.
One time, I was doing a live spot. Well, they were all live. I called Condo's Pharmacy with Chanel number 5. I called it Channel number 5. And we were doing a fake ice cream. We had a dish of fake ice cream that they used over and over again with a chocolate syrup squeeze thing that I would put the syrup on. So they fixed it up one day that the darn thing wouldn't work very well. So the chocolate syrup came out, but and we broke up. I broke up and left the set. Fortunately, we were into cartoons or something. They played cartoons.
Oh, that's another thing. Lots and lots of cartoons. But you know, we weren't the only people that broke up in those days.
No.
The big guys broke up, and I can remember some specific incidents. Even when I worked at WEAV, who were some of the big newsmen that broke up back in those days? And those became some of the most famous bloopers of all time. Who did the news at night? The nighttime news?
Well, it was.
How late? You mean the 6:30 section?
Probably on CBS.
Or they just everybody kept laughing
And they just laugh and laugh, and they would maybe start in a commercial. Seems to me like it was a Buick commercial for some reason, and they just started. The announcer started laughing, and then the newsman started laughing, and they both started laughing, and then of course America
Bloopers.
I
began
know
to
Ed
laugh.
McMahon has been broken a few times.
Oh, those were great days where they'd burn your copy. I guess that was the classic
another
where
one,
somebody
yeah.
would come in and
Set
just
fire
start
to
your copy on
And
fire.
if you didn't read it fast enough, you were done. Or you had to memorize the lines ahead before they burned.
I can remember I was a young announcer at WEAV in 1961, and I was working very hard to learn the business. And I walked in one day and sat down and started running the show, and I smelled something. And I knew it wasn't me, and I knew it wasn't anybody else in the building. And we thought for a long time there were dead rats in the walls.
Yay.
Everybody left the building. Everybody left the building, and I was the new guy in the block. So I had to keep it on the air all day, all night. Nazak came in and he said, I guess if it's still here tomorrow, we'll have to tear the wall out, and went home. And here I was there alone. And what had happened, somebody pulled a joke and took a brick of Limburger and put it behind the radiator.
Oh, come on.
And they eventually found the remains of the Limburger after I had sat there on the air for I don't know how many hours and endured this ungodly smell. But nobody ever admitted it. I think Al Corsi knew who it was because he laughed the loudest when he came in the next day. How about some other personalities? Can you remember? Al Corsi, of course, was a very colorful personality.
Heck of a nice fellow.
And a wonderful
Wonderful
guy.
copywriter. He
Very,
did a
very
beautiful
talented.
job with copy. He knew how to make a 30-second commercial, a 30-second commercial, and you were comfortable doing it in 30 seconds. Some of them used to write so many lines, you had to well, I won't say what you had to do, but you had to talk awful fast to get it in. Or you had to edit it. If you could read it ahead of time, you could edit it, but oh man.
The fact is, we all read at different speeds. Our delivery was comfortable at a faster or slower speed, and I could never read that many words in 30 seconds.
No.
And I was always unhappy if there would be like 12 lines instead of 8 lines.
Yeah.
Because I felt as though I would have to butcher it to get it in 30 seconds.
That's right.
That's why it was always hard for me at first to do a hard sell. People who were viewing have no idea what a soft sell and a hard sell was. Sometimes you'd have instructions that you'd have to hit it with the fast pitch.
Speaking of copywriters, we mentioned Esther Fox a while ago. She was there for years at WIRY. And Esther would write a copy, and if she wanted to add a little something or to change a copy, she wouldn't retype it. She would scratch it out and write above it.
Yeah.
And
I ran into those.
Martin Manx was he didn't read much commercial copy except when people required him to do it, requested to have Martin do it. And there used to be a store, as we all know, down here on Margaret Street. It was a hardware store, and upstairs in a balcony or the mezzanine
Marshall's?
floor, Marshall's store, and the lady had a gift shop there.
Oh, upstairs, yes.
And
nice.
so she would call in and want to change her copy from time to time, and Esther would scratch out something and add a little something. Well, one night, Mannix was reading a commercial. She had requested that he do it because he could really read a commercial, and he gave it everything he had when he did. And right in the middle of his newscast, he would stop and read this commercial. And so somebody went in. I don't remember who it was. I don't think it was me. I wouldn't be that mean. But they had, he said, you'll find a fine line of hen dishes, and he was naming these things, and hen dishes, and so they scratched out something and wrote goose pans. And so he started to read this thing, and he said, you'll find a fine selection of gifts such as hen dishes, goose pots. And all of a sudden he stopped to think, this doesn't sound right. And the guys in the control room were leaning on each other, laughing. And he realized that he broke up and he couldn't finish the commercial. But I'll always remember that because he really threw everything into it. Goose pans, hen dishes,
Goose pots.
goose pots.
Did you guys do remote broadcasts very early? I mean, they were doing remote broadcasts when I started in the business in '61, but how about before that?
They were doing.
What they're doing?
For the Clinton County Fair, was just getting started again. It had been dormant for the war years, I guess, and they started it up again. Yeah, we did remotes. Well, the Lytle family would go out there and play, and we did remotes when the old fair was getting started. And then right on through the county fairs.
Yeah, that first year it was out on...
somewhere out by the old base.
Yeah. What was the old base now? But
it was empty fields then.
Yeah. Then they moved over to Bailey Avenue Park.
Well, I'll never forget the time when I was on the all-night WIRY nightclub. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and we had a thunder shower. And I'm sitting there at the control board, you know, doing what I was supposed to do, and the tower got hit by lightning. And it took the transmitter and put it off for 48 hours.
Yeah.
But I mean, that lightning was coming out everywhere on that control board. It was uncanny. Scary as all get out. And here I'm there all alone. I'm sitting, I don't dare move. I fear I'm going to get electrocuted. Oh my,
there was an anecdote connected with something like that, and fortunately up there in the west end of town we never lost power very often.
Oh.
Unlike WEAV, we didn't have a generator that would kick on, So when we were off, we were off. And one time in the middle of the afternoon, we were off.
Yeah.
The place was dark, and somebody, I think it was Don Pelkey, walked in and he says, "Well, can't do something. Play a record."
No, that was.
Was that somebody else?
Yeah, it was Shire, Joel Shire. He called it.
Do something.
Yeah.
Play a record.
I'm answering the phone, and he said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" I said, "We're off the air." "Well, don't just sit there. Play music." And then he thought, he remembered what it was that he had said, and he oh, never mind, anyhow.
Never mind.
But to follow up on that connection between WIRY and WIRY, which was the early television station, did you both go back and forth? Did you go down to WIRY and work, and then you do a shift up there, or how did that work?
I stayed at television. Chet was still at WIRY.
Yeah,
He'd come up and do the kids show.
I just did the kids show, and I had a choice of staying there and doing the kids show or going back to work, but doing the kids show wasn't enough to make a living on, so I went back to radio.
You mentioned Dick Hildebrand in one of your columns. Well, when we first went on the air, he would come up and do his radio news in a studio way upstairs away from our TV studio. And then he'd come down and do the television news on the air.
I never knew that until
Yeah.
right now.
Yes, first, I don't know how, it didn't last too long. I think it was too much for him, you know.
Well, I think Shire said, make a choice.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't do
That was
the
it.
radio. I mean, this was after Shire had been pushed out by he didn't have enough clout with the.
He was a great newsman. Really fine newsman. And a fine gentleman.
Yes.
Yeah, he
Very
was a good
well
guy.
liked.
We had another newsman there too that we haven't mentioned yet, Sid Spiegel.
Sid Spiegel.
Oh my goodness,
Oh,
how could we
shit.
ever
For goofs.
talk
there.
about wonderful North Country, colorful personalities?
The car was capitulated through the air.
Oh, we could, you know what, and what a guy.
Yeah.
Now his credentials for the radio business were running a cleaning business in town. Isn't that what his family did for years?
Yeah.
Spiegel's
He was a
Cleaners?
great sportscaster. He did a good job with sports. Very good.
He'd go
But
live
when he
over
finally
at
got into the
Oldenburg,
news, he sure ruined the King's English, I'll tell you. But he was a great guy.
But once again, he was interesting and colorful,
Oh, there
and
were people who wouldn't
listened.
listen to anything else.
Now that brings me to another point. Speaking about Sid, at one point when Sid was doing the news, our station manager decided maybe it was time when we didn't have any more deaths in the news. Remember that? We tried to take the deaths off the news, and I thought they were going to march on the station. I mean, you know, this is hometown, small town radio, and people wanted to know who died, and that was as important to them as all the other major news stories. And we actually tried to remove that from the air, and as they say, due to popular demand,
it was returned.
the obituaries went back onto the newscast. I can tell you, it's easy to tell stories about poor Sid because he's not here to defend himself anymore, but there were some wonderful stories, and when Art was telling about falling asleep on the air, and I did that myself more than once in the wee small hours of the morning, Sid would sometimes take a nap in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah?
And in a place at that radio station, which is now used as a record library, was then the news room. And we often took groups of Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts through the station on tours. And we got to the newsroom, and there was a glass door, and the little Cub Scouts were there, and I said, "See that man in there with his head on the desk? That's the news director." But I said, "He's not sleeping. He's just resting his mind, getting prepared for the newscast." And I said, "You watch. In about 10 seconds, you're going to hear this news jingle, you know, the intros that we had for the news, and he'll jump right up there and a light will come on, a light bulb will light up, and he'll start reading the news." Well, of course, the 10 second was up, and the news jingle came on, and the light bulb came on, and all you could hear was...
Sound asleep.
And so the little kids they thought that was neat, of course, until I tapped on the door and said, "Sid, you're on the air." So that was interesting when he did jump up, but instead of starting with the news, he said, "Holy!" expletive deleted, and then began to read the news. But he had and
sailed right out of the
I'm sure those little Cub Scouts are telling their kids today about the time they met Sid Spiegel at WIRY. But there were great other personalities, and yes, you couldn't go through a broadcast like this without talking about Sid and the bobsled races. Remember the bobsled? Oh
He's
my!
Singing. He's sagging. He's too big shaking.
Little ass, big ass, and
they're down.
And they're down. Sid knew everybody from Handlebar to the Morgan family, and he knew that system very well. And I think that was the first time I ever met Jim McKay when we were doing the bobsled races one year. I don't know when that would have been, probably in the early 60s. And ABC television, when they were really getting into sports, decided they would do the bobsled race. And I can remember running into this young man who introduced himself to me as Jim McKay, ABC Sports, and he said, "Gordie, can you show me what a bobsled looks like? We got to go on the air in a short time." Wow. So I'd just like to see one of those things. So he wasn't necessarily happy to be there, and it's in those days it was very difficult to cover an event like that.
Oh yeah, nowadays they have a camera at every
every
turn.
When Peekaboo took her spill, boy.
Oh my.
They're right there.
You know, I noticed in the obituary column, I read the obituary columns more than I used to.
Don't we all? Make sure we're not there.
And I saw that Joe Howley died. And Joe Howley was...
the name is familiar.
Well, he was the manager and one of the co-owners, I guess, of the Plattsburgh Distributing Company. So they would do for the Genesee people, they had a who was the fighter that came up every so often and as a promotion for Genesee beer.
From Syracuse?
He was down and he was an onion farmer down there, and he was I can't remember who he was, but he had kind of a mean streak, I guess, as most champion fighters do. And for some reason or other, he took
Carmine Basilio.
Carmine Basilio,
yeah,
that's right, Carmine Basilio. And he had this thing of hauling off and hitting Joe Howley in the lower abdomen, you might say. And Joe was not at all happy about this, and he had to be nice to Basilio. And Ralph Fisher was the owner of the thing at that time, one of them anyway. And Joe, he used to say to me, "That's son of a gun." He didn't say son of a gun. "I wish he would stop doing that. I hate him." And then he would smile when Basilio came around again. I used to interview him when Basilio came up, and Basilio wasn't especially dumb or anything. He was a fairly well-spoken man, but he did have this thing about hitting Joe. And I always felt sorry for Joe. He was a nice man.
So radio did change a great deal since you people started in the business in other areas and then here in northern New York. My first job in radio was not a real job, paying job, but it was an opportunity to do something on the radio, and that was a weekly sports program on WICY in Malone, another sort of neighborhood program. And I remember a gentleman by the name of Don Pay. That name may ring a bell to some of you,
He was there for years.
because Don worked down there probably almost as long as Chester worked at WIRY, and that would have been well over 40 years. And that was how it started for me. But like most of us, I never dreamed that that's what I was going to end up doing for most of my adult life. So it's interesting. None of us ever made any money at it.
Not really.
We did the job. I mean, we managed to feed our families, and sometimes barely,
Yeah.
because overtime was not a very familiar word to most of
When
us.
I left WIRY in 1968, I was making $2.10 an hour. And I tried to get Donald to give me a raise, and he would say, I can't justify it. And I said, what do you mean? I says, you got me on the air in the daytime and at night, all night. I used to record 30 commercials every night for the daytime use.
It's amazing. Most of us can remember our early salaries. When I started out for George Bissell, it was 65 hours a week was my normal work week,
Yeah.
and I made $53. That was my salary.
I started out at $40 a week. There.
We worked 48 hours, I think. We got 40 regular and 8 hours of
Well,
overtime.
there was no overtime. I mean, well, yeah, they did.
Yeah,
Part of it
8
was
hours.
you were allowed to work so many hours of overtime because it was required that you got paid over.
You had to hit the big time to make any money at all. Really.
But we did it because
We did
we
it
like
for the
to do
joy
it,
of
and
it.
we don't want to leave the impression as we wrap this program up in a while that we didn't have great times. We all had a passion for it, and it's very hard to describe that passion
No,
to
that's
young
right.
people.
That's
When I
right.
talk to young people about doing something in life that they can call a career, I mention the word passion all the time. Because I can't imagine working at a job for all those years without enjoying it.
I was very fortunate. I have had 2 wonderful careers, really. And I could probably say 3. I started out as a cabinet maker. And I went to radio school in New York City, went into radio, and I spent probably 23 years full-time, and maybe 3 years of part-time. And then I came into the piano business. It started as a hobby and ended up as a career. And I've had 40 years of working with pianos. And a lot of that was part-time, in the beginning, but it's been a wonderful career. And I have never regretted either of them, really. Radio was a wonderful career, but it was tough on me. With my poor eyesight, I couldn't drive. And, I had to use 2 pair of glasses when I read the commercials. Could you see me with a magnifying glass or holding the switches and trying to read a commercial?
Now that you
No.
mention that, it brings up another point, in that I was thinking of the people who had worked with us and for us who had trouble reading. And I remember seeing some of your, and we're probably not old enough to be called artifacts ourselves, but some of the things that we left behind might be.
Yeah.
And you were a very clever person in designing. You designed things. I can
Yeah.
remember you designed a special holder for all of our tape cartridges.
Yeah, yeah.
And you had a special.
I built them.
You
For
built
Don,
it.
yeah, I
You
made
had a
it.
special light that you used to
Yeah.
see with.
Yeah.
Sid Spiegel also had he had sugar diabetes, so he had
Yeah.
terrible eyesight problem. And Ben Everest, there's another name that none of us have mentioned, but Ben Everest was connected with the radio business in this town for a long, long time.
Yeah.
He was a young man at that time that had a terrible eyesight problem
Yeah,
because going home from work one day, I guess, didn't he have
Got a wreck.
new car and got in a wreck and lost his eye?
He got a new automobile, and when he got it, he started to drive that day, and he didn't stop driving that car until around midnight or something like that, maybe later than that. And he fell asleep and hit a tree out on Route 9, and he dragged himself over to a house, finally pounded on the door, and the lady let him in. And because she was afraid and couldn't figure out what he was doing out there. But that was a terrible accident that he had, and he had one eye was not good anyway, and he almost lost sight in the. I guess he did lose sight of it.
The other one detached the retina, yeah.
The one that was not good
It's the only
was
one
the
he had
eye
left.
that left.
He had a lot of courage, that young man.
He ultimately learned how to read with special glasses, and then ultimately the success story ended with him getting a driver's license, which was against all the odds,
Yeah.
thanks to some modern technology.
Yeah.
And just as we mentioned this and talk about Ben and the all-night wiry nightclub, which we all did from time to time.
I did it too long.
I remember some other names like James Rogers III.
Jim Rogers.
Jim Rogers, who worked at Wiry for a long time, decided to leave and buy his own radio station in Saranac Lake, WNBZ.
Still going strong, isn't he?
Still going strong. He and his wife, charming people and their family, but Jim was leaving Wiry just as I was getting there. Other personalities that we've talked about before in various forums include Lenny Kane.
Well, Lenny was a great guy.
Long time.
Another colorful personality who moved down to Kingston, and we see him from time to time as his mom, I
He was a
believe.
great sportscaster.
Iris Friedman.
Yep, who still lives in town.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, it's terrible to leave people out.
We forgot Hortense Graves, too.
Hortense.
Oh,
She was an
Hortense,
old-time radio gal, and then she went and did TV programs, Junior Jamboree,
Yeah.
and This Is For You on Wiry Radio. She would take requests and then
Yeah.
play the music. I
Well, she
remember.
started out at Wiry doing that,
A very sweet personality she was.
and then she brought
Was
it
it
over.
Junior Jamboree?
Junior
Yeah.
Jamboree over to.
Yeah, started on radio and took it to television. Some kids still remember. I bumped into people saying, I was on Junior Jamboree.
And Hortense was always kind enough to call every time we had an anniversary. Chet will remember, as Wiry celebrated each significant anniversary, we tried to bring back old tape recordings and old people who had worked there. And I can remember in 1975, when Wiry had been on the air for 25 years, many people who had worked there called us up from across the country. Hortense always called us often. Just a wonderful personality. And Alice Potter. How's that for another?
Oh,
She
Alice.
was on top.
I remember.
Everyone here
Beautiful
remembers Alice.
blonde.
Beautiful.
Beautiful blonde. Boy, was she a pretty woman. Yeah.
She ran a show in the evening, sort of a sexy sort of a voice, and she played romantic
That would
songs.
be a good way to describe it.
She
Chet.
was on radio? I forgot
Yeah.
that. So she
Oh,
came
yeah.
to television and did.
Yeah.
I worked with her on For You, Madame for a year or more. Very nice.
And then there's Pinto. Remember Pinto? He was a salesman.
Yeah.
He worked at WEAV as a salesman for a while. The guy could sell, and he didn't care how he did it. He would call up and he'd say, "Hey, I hear you on Wiry." He said, "You're going to make me look bad if you don't." This is when I was at WEAV for a year. He said, "You're going to make me look bad if you don't do that." He says, "Can't you give me a little help here?" And I would say, "Holy moly, what a way to sell!" But he sold. He could sure sell.
Remember Archie Patno, too? Long time.
Yeah, there was a guy who goes back a
From
few
Los
years.
Angeles Forks.
Yeah.
Alice Potter went on to move to the Midwest and became a television personality, had a tragic accident, was hurtled through the windshield
Yeah.
of a car, and
Yeah.
that beautiful face of hers was disfigured for life.
That
But,
is a happy note.
well,
I think we ought to wind up on that.
but she's very healthy and well, and I've communicated often with her daughter, who's in the book publishing business, and with Alice herself over the last couple of years. And I'm proud to say that our friend Dick Hildreth, I renewed my friendship with him in his later years.
Great guy.
Just a wonderful personality, so I communicated him with him right up to the time of his death, and he was just a charming personality. We've left a lot of people out,
Yeah,
And-
can't remember them all.
and but before we end this program, you got a little stuff in your duffel, and we're going to look in that duffel bag in just a moment. Well, we're charged up again. We're charged up, and it takes old photographs to do that. And you can see a picture of a photograph on the screen, and I want to chat about this. Tell me about some of the people who were here. Chet Bird, who have we got in this photograph?
This was a Christmas party in 1953. We used to have them right in the Wiry main studio there, with a few Manhattans and martinis
I
and
guess so.
whatever. I guess so.
Manhattan's mainly, I think.
So name the paper from left to right as you can.
Well, I'm over on the left, sitting near the
With
window.
the glasses.
My wife Dottie
Under the boom,
and
into the
Joel
boom,
Shire.
standing up with the angel just above his
Yeah.
head, which may or may
Very
not have been
angelic.
appropriate.
Very good. And Hortense Graves.
The one you just mentioned standing in the middle of the photograph.
And the famous Martin Manx. You'll notice he has a cup in his hand.
Yeah.
I guess
Yes.
we use paper cups at that party.
To the far right.
And Chester O is over there smoking his pipe.
Telltale trademark corncob pipe. I don't know who the young man with his back to us in the lower
No,
right
can't.
would have been
I went for some time with a bow tie.
The bow tie motif.
for a long time. Long after I first met you, I forgot that. We should mention that in those days, and for a while after that, there was a lot of live music on radio,
Oh, yes.
as there was on television. But in those days, there was a lot of live music because for many years after records came out, they weren't sure how successful recorded music was going to be. So we had most radio stations had sizable studios. As you could see in that photograph, there was a piano,
Yeah?
and later on an organ, I think, at one point.
Yeah.
And we did a lot of musical things, and sometimes we were forced to whistle and sing through some of those 4-H auctions where people would call up and say, "I want to hear Manx sing My Wild Irish Rose." Chester, I'm sure you were forced to sing and whistle and quote a few lines of "The Wind She Blow on Lac Champlain."
Well, I didn't have a whole lot of requests that I can remember.
Play the musical song.
But you know, there's something I want to mention before we go any farther, and we do have a few artifacts left here. The Happy Whistler thing and the Miss Lonely Hearts. Miss Lonely Hearts had to retire a few years before you did. But how did that start, and why do you imagine it was such an immense success?
I have no idea.
I've asked you that before, and you give me the same cotton-picking answer every time.
I don't know. It was something I used to like Bob and Ray on the
As we all did. They were great.
And so I tried to do some of the things that they did, or not plagiarism perhaps, but a copy sort of a thing. And I think that might have started something about it. I just happened to do it one day, and it kind of grew. Frankly, I don't know what my voice a little later on. I couldn't do Miss Lonely Hearts. I'm sorry. And then some people began to say that she had low self-esteem.
I wonder where that came from.
I don't know, but I always thought she was rather arrogant myself. But
With the dog, and with the musical saw, with the barest of implements to work with, you managed to pull off an extra persona or two on your program, which were tremendously successful over the years. And it was we almost had a special wake when she retired. That was, and you brought her. You would bring her back on special occasions once in a great while after that.
yeah, I could. I heard one recently that somebody had recorded, and Bob Pooler recorded that, I believe, and I had forgotten that I did that. But
During an anniversary, probably in
yeah,
maybe '75.
I think it was a sale where we were a sales pitch that we were trying to get people to call in, and but anyway, I taped her voice, and I would talk back to it, and I dubbed that off so that we could both talk together at the same time. That was one problem that you had. You couldn't talk
Couldn't talk over each other.
over each other. No.
But people thought you were, and many people believed that you were really harassing and haranguing this poor woman just because her dog would shake all over the studios in the morning. And that was an exercise that greeted people at the beginning of the day. Did you ever do voices, Bird?
On the puppet show that I did,
I forgot about the
Mr. Daffy had a voice way up here. And H.J. Hot Dog Hound had a voice way down here.
I remember that. Oh, man.
Well, one day, a darn Frankfurt jet, a fellow I'll never forget, dropped a firecracker in back of me while I was doing the show. Scared the heck out of me. I pushed the little stage over. It was made of plywood. It just had a window in it, you know, and you work up here with your puppets. So there I was, exposed to the world. So quickly they went to a cartoon. That was a cartoon show. To cartoon carnival. Oh,
whenever we got into trouble with doing that, you would you want to hear a cartoon? And they would say, yeah.
And there we go with the cartoon. So you did the voices on the puppet show.
Speaking of puppets, there's one with Chet and Dick Krause used to do puppets.
All right, let's hold this up here and get a good shot of this.
Dick Krause was a
great puppeteer, professional, yes.
The bottom one?
Yeah, the bottom one there. Do you remember the Mikey? What were the names of the puppets?
Mikey Phone.
Mikey Phone and something. Kathy Ode.
Kathy Ode.
Mikey Phone and Kathy Ode?
Yes, I think so.
And oh my goodness,
there's
look
the
at this.
Bar 5 Ranch gang on the top picture too.
There it is. WIRI TV live origination Monday through Friday, 5 to 6 p.m.
That was Joel Shire's tie-in with WIRY. See, WIRY Radio and WIRI TV.
I'm glad you mentioned Dick Krause, another interesting personality who was connected with the business in many ways. And didn't he run a hobby shop?
Hobby shop, the Hobby Hanger.
A hobby hanger, and Betty Krause, sterling personality in many ways, and we could, if we had hours and hours to do this program, I could remember so many great Betty Krause stories. And wait a minute, there was another voice.
Oh, yes.
There was another
Oh,
voice.
Uncle Ezra, by gum, he was still on there. 992. We had a lot of fun with that one. I'll never forget when Don Pelkey suddenly discovered that Uncle Ezra was on the air at 5 o'clock in the morning. He never knew anything about it for 6 or 7 months it went on. And I used to hang a microphone out the window to catch the birds, which started singing in the meadow outside at about 4 o'clock in the morning, you know. And I'd get calls from the farmers. They would call up and they would put them on the air with me, you know. And they would be out in the barn and you'd hear the cow moo and all that stuff going on. And they would say, when is Uncle Ezra going to bring Annabelle on? Well, Annabelle was his girlfriend, something like Chet used to have. Only he would have his elixir. And he was always drinking his elixir when she came in. His elixir was strawberries that he would squeeze and make booze out of or whatever, you know. And we had quite an ongoing thing going. And Pelkey knew nothing about it until one day one of the salesmen came in and said that Peru GLF wanted to buy Uncle Ezra's show. What's he talking about?
What the heck is Uncle Ezra?
He didn't know anything about it. So they told him about it. So he listened, got up early in the morning and listened to it. He came in that morning and he says, who gave you permission to put a program on the air without my authorization, you know? I said, well, it's so boring in here in the morning. I said, play the same damn music.
You gotta talk to yourself once in a while.
I needed something to keep them going bananas. I said, so I just gradually put that together. Well, that's enough of that. I don't want to hear any more of it, you know? He got so pressed from the people in the audience, the farmers and so forth, wanting to know where Uncle Ezra was, that he finally allowed it to go back on the air, and they sold it for 13 weeks.
Wow, that's neat. This is a rather interesting book, and I don't know if Art's got a copy, but most of the rest of us do have a copy, and this dates back more than a short period of time. WMFF, the North Country's own station.
When I first came in the spring of '48, it was still WMFF. And then about 6 or 8, or whenever Chet came, they switched over to WEAV.
You know, we didn't mention what, there's a microphone in the back which says Blue. Let's talk about what it was.
Blue Network.
Blue Network and the Red Network, NBC.
Far different from things a few years later, but WMFF Radio Center.
Yes.
When WIRY first went on the area was called Radio Park.
Yeah.
Oh,
I remember Radio Center.
everything that WEAV did, WIRY did, because Betty Croft set up both of these programs. They had evening, I don't know, one program called Evening Song or something, and WIRY went on with musical, I can't remember these names of them. I thought I could remember them all, but it was just something, just a little different.
Just a tad
but the
different.
same kind of a program.
You know, something else we ought to mention is that 1340 frequency didn't always belong to WIRY.
That's right. That's right. Well, they had to change their frequency because they wanted to go to 5 kilowatts.
5,000 watts.
960 then, yeah.
Yeah.
When they went to WEAV, they increased power to.
They were going to go up a kilowatt. They were going to go up to 1,000 watts.
1,000 watts, yeah.
But they showed that they wouldn't have the kind of coverage that they should have for the 1,000 watts. So they went to 5. They got permission to go to 5. And as I remember that.
There were, maybe I can show some of the pictures.
Some of this is fascinating stuff we're getting into. You
Betty
know.
Krause is in
It must really be setting the audience on edge.
Anybody in particular you want?
Well, we can mention George Bissell Sr. He's been talked about numerous times during the course of the program, and his son George Jr., who was then just a tyke, and Chet and Bird both have memories of George, and there's a picture of Betty Swift,
Betty Swift.
then Betty Krause, and a few other things, including some network personalities who managed to get in this book. Madeline Fitzgerald. Some of these people I'm familiar with and some I'm not. Hortense Graves, who we mentioned many times. Winifred O'Mara.
Oh, wasn't she a great gal? Boy.
And her name was
Provo.
Winnie Provo.
Yeah.
Winnie's the one that gave me the message that my son on Long Island was about to be born, and I took off in my brother's old Falcon station wagon, and it's a story well known to my friends, and
Winnie was a
trip I
wonderful
almost
person.
didn't make back. And there's Betty again, and so many other people named, and the late Tom Mix on a visit to WMFF.
Big news.
We have an autographed picture of Tom Mix. We probably, I think my wife's brother sent for him when he was a young teenager on a radio show. Anne and her Happy Ramblers. Oh boy.
I think that's Betty Sherman.
Betty
she
Sherman,
continued
the
that
late
on.
Betty Sherman.
Yes.
I interviewed her very late in life, only
Yeah,
3 or 4 years ago. She lived here in the city, and
She used to
Great
come in
gal,
with her
too.
show in
Yeah.
the morning when I was on.
That's a priceless book you've got.
it's a wonderful book.
Yeah,
And
it really is.
I may mention a few names for the people who've been radio fans for a long time, or who are young people interested in radio lore, because here we have people like Ma Perkins.
Ma Perkins. Believe it or not, Ripley. Remember that?
Believe it or not, Ripley, Lum
Lum
Abner.
Oh my
Great.
On the
goodness.
Ziv. Another Ziv.
Easy Aces,
Yes.
They were on the Ziv.
Dinah Shore,
Oh boy.
wonderful personality, and on throughout this book. This is an absolute classic. Jimmy Fiddler,
From Hollywood.
Ted Malone, a young Milton Berle,
Uncle Milty. Before he was Uncle Milty.
Joan Bishop, The Breakfast Club,
Oh yes, Don McNeil.
Yeah, Don
Don McNeil,
March around the breakfast table.
and look at Durwood Kirby in the early days. I have to show this picture of Durwood Kirby, one of the most famous radio and then television announcers of all time. And there were special stories to tell about almost all the people in this book we aren't the only one that had stories to tell us about. Morgan Beatty, there's another familiar name from Network. Walter Winchell, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all the ships. Let's go to press. And here's another one, sports fans everywhere. And Bill Stern. Wait, we have to show a picture of Red Barber and Bill Stern. What was Stern's program that was so popular on the radio for so many years? I cannot remember. Exceptional stories of all kinds.
Was he the one that said the Pope was a pitcher, a winning pitcher or something for the... He always had a big story. It had nothing to do with the truth.
I don't remember.
I can't remember.
Arturo Toscanini.
Picture of Toscanini, the NBC Symphony Orchestras. Oh my.
Old shots.
Airplane.
He started over in Tupper Lake.
We talked about our remote mobile units, as we called them. Have a look at an early WMMF mobile unit. It looks like about a 1934 Ford or Chevy with the insignia on the side, WMFF, which would be, and that would be a picture taken, where would you guess, at the Bailey Avenue ballpark, the old Bailey Avenue. I had the distinction to be there on many occasions. I boxed my own brother there once on the 4th of July in 1955. I called myself Gordie Little, and he called himself Jim Small.
Jim Small. Who won?
It was a draw. We almost killed each other. And I was there when they began to tear it down, and that was kind of a nostalgic moment. Remember when they tore the old Bailey Avenue grandstands down?
Home of the Carlings.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think it would be good to show a couple more pictures here, because on this page you will see a transmitter on the Boynton Avenue scene. You'll see the inside of a control room, and you'll see the picture of a man whom we've mentioned numerous times, Jack Nazak.
That's where Plattsburgh Garden Center is now.
That's so, just so people know, over on Boynton Avenue, that's where this is located, where the old WMMF transmitter was, and Jack Nazak only died not an awful long time ago.
About a year and a half, yeah.
Just a tremendous personality.
Oh, he was just a sweetheart of a guy. That's all there was to it.
Do anything, huh? In the engineering end.
What else have you got over there that we got a little bit of time left?
We talked about Alice Potter. You know, she's right in the middle there. That was 19. What's that?
Oh my goodness!
In the kitchen with "For You, Madame."
I remember Grace Reese ran that.
Grace Reese was the first. I got
Grace is living down in Florida, and we see her every so often when she comes up. They were great friends of ours.
Cameras were a lot different back then, weren't they, Bird, than they ended up being later on, and that was Alice Potter.
First one
Bird
was
Berdan,
Ruth Foote was the first hostess, and then Grace Reese, and later on Alice Potter and Gene Schiffler, and we went through a lot of hostesses.
I remember she told me one time that she interviewed the sergeant of the recruiting sergeant of the Marine Corps that was here, your friend, that he was quite a character.
Yeah, I can't remember his name.
Anyway, he was going to present her with a plaque from the Marine Corps for what that she had done for him and all that. And he said, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to present you Grease Race.
Grease Race. Yeah.
And he never even realized that he said, she said, he just went right on. He said, but then I've been called worse things than Grease Race.
One of the greatest bloopers of all time was Hubert Heaver, right?
That's right.
That's terrific. And those photographs you looked at a few moments ago were vintage 1955.
And here's
the year
Bill
I graduated
Knight.
from high school.
The first weatherman on Channel 5 was Bill Knight. And you see the blackboard there with just chalk marks. That's all we had to work with.
Probably got as accurate as
a slightly younger Bird Berdan. I can see that even backwards looking through the back of the picture. And did you ever graduate the felt, or did you always use a blackboard? What were you using when you finished?
Well, we had different visuals. Finally, we went to color, you know, along in the 60s somewhere along there. And you know, when I did the Atlantic weather, I could only do the early portion, the 6 to 7. So they had to get gals in there at night for the weather. And Tara Savage.
And Tara Savage.
Penny Newton.
And Penny Newton.
And Al Hill did the lake weather for a long time.
Al Hill, now there was a character.
Another great personality.
Another great personality.
Well, yeah, not character, personality.
Great guy. He did the horror things.
Oh, and
The
they
old
were so
studio.
successful.
Count, what was his name? Count something. Count Lothian. And he would come up out of the coffin for the opening.
Do you remember that?
I remember when he was telling about that on that show you did when you were, that was his 35th or 25th anniversary or something.
Yeah.
It was wild to hear him tell about what he had to do.
Makeup too.
Yeah.
A lot of makeup. He was great. Then he did Granny. It was a takeoff on Grandma Fricker. Jonathan Winters.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Granny. He was good at that too. And then he did a show called Clutch Cargo, and dressed up in these jazzy aluminum suits and stuff.
I had forgotten Clutch Cargo until you are triggering a plethora of memories here. You know, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about all the various, just bring the pictures out as you find them there, about all the various drives and games on both radio and television. Chet, I know you've had a lot of fun with those.
That's Alice Potter in the middle of this picture.
Oh, let's just take a look at this
interviewing
photograph.
Air Base wives. You know, we got a lot of interviews from the Air Base people.
Oh boy, we've sure missed
Missed the bases, right. We'd get wives who were stationed in the Orient or in Europe or in Africa and bring them in, and they would do their recipes, you know, a recipe that they had learned.
Oh, what a wonderful photograph that is. But how many games can you remember? How many of the games besides the famous Wiry treasure hunt?
That was a great
And
one.
others. That was a good one.
Oh, man.
We had fun with that one.
That
didn't
went
we?
on a long time, too.
Dialing for Dollars was one, but that was later.
Dialing for Dollars and, oh my goodness.
That's Grace Reese again.
That's Grace again. 1 year later in
That was-
1956.
That was the permanent kitchen set we had set up there for a long time, good many years it was there.
Blair and Weber Studios. I see the stamp on the
And
back.
in the old studios, we had a mouse problem. Sometimes mice would crawl along the pipes and scare some of our hostesses. You could actually look up and see them running across. But they finally licked that.
Yeah, some people don't like mice running around.
Isn't that funny? Now there's a little
Oh,
later on.
my.
Neil
Neil
Drew, Steve
Drew.
Herman.
And Steve Herman. All right, let's get this on.
Neil Drew, I hear occasionally on the,
On Malone?
yeah,
That's on Malone's.
Neil Drew came to work at Wiry as a very young radio announcer, his second job in the business, and he was a rock jock.
Oh.
And he called himself Neil Drew, but he said he wanted to introduce himself as Neil Drew Mike-side. This is the way of saying that he was next to the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
For 2 weeks he worked there, and I thought his name was Neil Drew Mike-side. And he worked for a very short period of time at Wiry and was very afraid, as many people were, of Don Pelkey Sr., and left and was offered that position as news director after Sid died and before Mike Mannix came aboard, and refused it because he was panic-stricken. He was afraid of Don Pelkey Sr., but he's done many things over the years, worked on television as news director, a lot of humorous times back in those days, and then went back into the radio business. Steve, I don't know where Steve is now, do you?
Out in one of the Dakotas. He's in television yet. An executive.
Wonderful memory. All right, here we go.
There's
This is the...
There's the old board, like a school teacher's blackboard.
The bird, the bird's the word.
So I changed hats for the following day's weather. If it was going to be cold, I'd have earmuffs or a fur hat or a snowy hat. And then in the summer, I did the
you kind of hook things up a little
hook
bit.
things up. Yeah, it was hokey. Now here's Chester O and myself. This is a local show that we did at the college auditorium. What was it called? Now and Then?
Now
I
and
think,
Then.
Yeah. And James A. Fitzpatrick is in there. Chet Bosworth and myself. Some of the gals I can't remember. But the dance teacher was in the middle there.
November 28th.
Nancy, who's the oldest receiving girl? Nancy or Pat?
I should know those names.
Well, anyway, that was a local show. Those gals were dancing. Chet sang oh, you were the villain in that, but you sang a song, by the sea, by the sea, by the beautiful sea. Great. Great little show. I think we're running out of steam here.
You know,
my mouth is getting dry.
We have had a wonderful opportunity. I'm so delighted not only to know all these people surrounding me, but to be able to sit down together and to palaver, as we used to say, and come up with a
schmooze, they call it.
Yeah.
We've enjoyed this very much. I don't know whether the audience is going to.
And but before we leave, there is one thing that's always bothered me, and most of my viewers and listeners and readers, they want to know the story behind Rag Mop. We can go out on a happy note here. Can we reveal everything about that story?
Almost.
I have this quality of being a teetotaler, and I would hate to disillusion anybody on that idea. But at one time we weren't, were we?
No.
Teetotalers.
It was the Marine Corps League, and we used to have parties every year on the Marine anniversary, in November. One of them was out at the old Club 13 before the base was built. The old road to Peru had the Club 13 on it. Wild and woolly times. Anyway, we had a good many libations that evening, and and Rag Mop was the big song.
Ames Brothers.
We just loved it. Ray G and Moopy.
I remember. I seem to remember the Elks Club as a place where we also rendered that.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'm sure you had a lot of requests for it after the first time.
We spent a lot of time together in those days. There was a guy that came to, oh well, here we go again.
Yes.
A television station when they were building that, and he was brought in as expert on setting up television stations.
Right.
He was the one who stuck the knife into Joel Shire's back eventually and got him out of there, but he had hopes of being the manager of it when he did. What was his name?
Walter Stiles.
Walter Stiles.
Big fella that operated.
Oh, yeah.
When he went down to Austin's men's store, he could buy a dozen neckties, things of that type.
Yeah. Carlos Austin said to me one time, this fella that comes in, do you know Stiles? He says he works for the television station. I said, yeah. He said, is he somebody that reputable man? And I said, as far as I know, he is. He seems to be. He said, he's got a lot of money. He said, well, he came in the other day and he said to me, I'd like to see some Arrow shirts. And he said, I showed him some. And he said, yeah, that's fine. I'll take a dozen of those. And he said, now I need some socks. So could I see some of those? And he said, yeah, those are fine. Give me a couple of dozen of those. He says, and I've never made a sale like that before. And I'm afraid I never asked Carlos if he got paid for that, but I'm sure he didn't.
That would be another chapter of the story.
That's another chapter in the story.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Art, Pierce.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thanks for hosting the show and your wonderful piano workshop.
Yeah.
That's the subject of an entirely different show.
Yeah.
We've covered a little bit of territory since the program began. Bird Berdan, Chester O. Bosworth, Gordie Little, and Calvin back there, he's got a story. One of the days we'll put him in this chair and run the camera for an hour and a half.
I was on Bar 5 Ranch time.
Oh, you were?
See?
Oh, see, there's a whole other part of the story. He was the kid with the bony rear end sitting on that saddle which went to nowhere.
Yeah.
We could have talked about the elephant too, but we didn't have to get into that. But that's a whole nother story.
He might have been the one who kept pulling on my sleeve while I was doing a commercial, and I said, yes, what can I do? And he said, my dad said, if I have to pee, to tell you.
What a great way to end the program. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone out there, for tolerating this kind of nonsense. And you never know next time where we're going to be for the program called Our Little Corner.